Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning. We're going to wait just a few more minutes before we begin, but if you could, go ahead and let me know by typing in the chat box if you can see the presentation and if you can hear me okay, or if you're having any other issues. Wonderful. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Rick. Wonderful. Okay, we'll wait just a few more minutes and get started. Hello again, and welcome to this webinar. As you may know, January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So this is the second webinar in our series this month. If you missed last week on the intersection of human trafficking and foster care, please be sure to go back and watch that on our YouTube channel. And next week, we're going to be talking about safety planning. So if you have not already, please make sure that you register for that as well. And while a few folks are still filtering in, and before we get started, I'll just share a little bit about me. My name is Carissa. I'm a program coordinator here at the Coalition. And before joining the Coalition, I spent time working with a therapeutic foster care agency, and I was employed with an anti-trafficking organization for around 5 years. So what we're talking about today, the intersection of trafficking and families, is something that I'm very passionate about. And if you attended our webinar last week, this next part might sound a little familiar to you, but the first thing I'd like to do is just get a level set on what we are and are not talking about when it comes to human trafficking. When we're talking about adults, human trafficking is the exchange of sex or labor for something of value when there is the presence of either force, fraud, or coercion. So in the case of sex trafficking, sex also includes other types of sex work, such as pornography or exotic dancing. When we're talking about labor trafficking, that could include anything from agricultural work to the hospitality industry. And it's important to remember that the something of value being exchanged does not have to be money in either of these cases, either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. A person could be victimized because they were seeking shelter or protection, or perhaps in exchange for drugs. Now, when we talk about minors, the elements of force, fraud, and coercion are completely removed. No force, fraud, or coercion is required in the case of commercial sex and a minor. So according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, you might know that as the TVPA, and Tennessee state law, minors cannot consent to commercial sex under any circumstance ever. So conversations about age of consent or how close in age a victim and a perpetrator are do not apply when it comes to commercial sex. And just for an example, many of you are probably familiar with a case that's gotten a lot of media attention lately, and that's the case of Centoya Brown. Centoya Brown was granted clemency earlier this month from a life prison sentence that she received as a minor in 2004. Centoya was only 16 years old when she took a man's life in self-defense after he brought her to his home for a sexual encounter. And in the midst of this crisis, one of the things that Centoya was worried about was returning empty-handed to the pimp who was trafficking her. However, in 2004, we didn't have the language or the statutes to recognize her case as one of commercial sexual exploitation. And I believe that anti-trafficking organizations and our societal awakening to this issue has played a large part in finding justice for her. But one of the wrongs that justice advocates are working continually to correct is the way that we speak about Centoya's case and others. And that's identifying her as a, quote, child prostitute. Child prostitutes do not exist ever in any circumstance. So before we move on, are there any clarification points or questions here about what is or is not human trafficking, whether we're talking about adults or for minors? Give just a second. Anybody has any questions? I want to make sure we really get that definition before we move on. Okay, well, we will go ahead and dive right in then. There are 4 types of familial trafficking that we're going to be talking about today, and they are unrecognized trafficking, forced labor, sex trafficking, and lastly, child marriage. So let's first talk about unrecognized familial trafficking. So this is trafficking that occurs when a family member unknowingly enters another member of their family into a trafficking ring. Internationally, so we're talking about in other nations, it usually looks something like this. A remote village consistently struggles with poverty and a lack of opportunity for the next generation. And one day, a wealthy-looking business person shows up claiming to be a hotel owner in the nearest big city. And he'll claim that he's opening a new property and he needs to hire a large pool of housekeepers or waitresses. He'll claim that he will provide training and education for their daughters. He might offer in this big city job to just take a portion of her paycheck and send it back to the family members for them to make money. And this sounds like a dream come true to people in need. It sounds like the only viable chance and opportunity for these families. And sometimes dozens of young women and girls from these villages will follow this man for this opportunity in the big city. But of course, this is not a legitimate job offer. There are two possible outcomes in this situation. The first scenario is labor trafficking. And in this scenario, maybe there really is a hotel. But instead of a legitimate actual job, these women are taken into slave labor. Traffickers charge outrageous recruitment fees or rent, and they force victims to stay in terrible conditions that they cannot escape from, and they're actually paid little to never once these fees and rent charges are taken out. And the other possible outcome in this international scenario is sex trafficking. And there is no hotel or no job offer at all. And instead, this is essentially a kidnapping ploy to sell women into sex trafficking, either to brothels or gangs or escort services. And the thing that both of these scenarios have in common is that the victims will likely never see their families again. These are both scenarios where the family, usually it's the patriarch in the family or village elders, are sending their children to have a better opportunity without knowing or without recognizing that it was actually a trafficker who was in front of them. And we see that play out just the same way with male victims. And what that usually looks like is a trafficker shows up claiming to be a factory owner. So they'll make those same promises about factory labor and education and advancement for the young men in the village, but then it's revealed later to be a labor trafficking situation. So that probably sounds pretty far off. You may be wondering how this happens in the United States, and I can speak to my experience and what I've seen. Most commonly, it involves traffickers related to two industries, and those are modeling and entertainment. And in this scenario, a trafficker may approach a young girl and her mom at the mall and claim that he's a talent scout looking to add portfolios to his agency, and she is just the perfect candidate. And he'll have business cards and a website, and he may actually even have a legitimate modeling business. However, despite this parent's due diligence, what she looks into, what this mom sees as a potential opportunity to support her daughter and what she wants to do, this scenario is not what it seems. This youth may do a few legitimate jobs up front, and that adds to the con. But then all of a sudden, she finds herself forced to model naked, or to strip, or she performs sex acts. And at this point, this victim feels like they can't escape, that no one will believe them, immense shame, feeling like she should have known better, and she doesn't reach out for help, and a lot of times her family is none the wiser. In the same scenario, I've seen play out with singing contracts and other talent-based industries. So those are a few examples of unrecognized trafficking in families, both internationally and domestically. Are there any questions about that? Okay, let's move on to talking about forced labor. So first, let me say that far less data is available on the issue of forced labor. And one of the reasons that labor trafficking is far more hidden than sex trafficking is the fact that it is not forward-facing. It doesn't rely on interaction with the public or with ads in order for it to succeed. But labor trafficking, whether agricultural or in restaurant kitchens or in domestic servitude, does not rely on those types of things that we're able to track. So unlike in sex trafficking, there's no advertisement placed online to sell a victim, and that makes it really hard to collect data. And sometimes labor trafficking in families looks like this. There is child labor in a family business. Perhaps a child is working late hours after school in a family restaurant, or is helping his parents at their day job in the hospitality industry. And similarly to the unrecognized trafficking scenarios, there is no ill will here. Parents are not intentionally causing harm to their children. These are not usually scenarios where we see, families doing something that is wrong in their eyes. It's sometimes a cultural expectation that a child contribute to the family finances in this way, or sometimes it's just a real life necessity. The family has to have help, to have the income, to have food and shelter. But the good thing is that usually these situations are very solvable problems. Instead of being about finding and stopping a bad guy, as a service provider, it's about connecting these families to resources to make ends meet. It's about closing the gaps in poverty and income and employment. And other times, it's about the education piece, helping new Americans understand what laws are in our country about children in the workplace and offering help and support where we can in that realm. So in these scenarios, it's likely not obvious that there is a trafficking situation occurring in the family unless you look closely. But it is something that you should try and press further on when you see a child engaged in a job that's not age appropriate or seems unduly difficult or unpaid. Are there any questions about labor trafficking in families? Okay. The next type of familial trafficking that we're going to discuss is sex trafficking. And to be upfront here, especially as a parent, this is a topic that's difficult for me to speak well about. But I'm going to do my best to explain something that is incredibly tragic and hard to understand. Familial sex trafficking happens when a family member, usually a caregiver, knowingly sells sex acts with their child in exchange for something of value like drugs or money. And you can see that reflected in some of the headlines on your screen. Tennessee parents accused of selling daughters into porn face a trial. Mom accused of trading preteen daughter to drug dealer. Parents accused of trying to sell kids for drugs. And the opioid crisis has had a significant impact on familial sex trafficking. In my experience, this is by far one of the most common scenarios where familial sex trafficking plays out. And in particular, we've seen a sharp rise in the number of young children, toddlers, and infants who have been victimized. And it's important to understand that this didn't happen in a vacuum, and this did not happen overnight. The social worker in me knows that these parents and these perpetrators in the headlines have stories that did not begin here. That their journey of addiction and trauma and abuse and assault put these families and perpetrators on a path that is long and that is complicated. And we could spend a long time going into the neuroscience. We could talk about how opioids and alcohol numb a person's ability to experience feelings deeply. And if you're not experiencing a deep love for your child, you cannot be motivated by it. So the scenario is this is how it plays out. A parent is in the grips of drug addiction. She has nothing left. She has no money. She has nothing else of value. She is desperately addicted. It's a matter of life and death to her. And a proposition is made. She can allow a drug dealer access to her child, where he's orchestrating and facilitating sexual abuse in exchange for drugs. Or it could happen that this addicted caregiver is selling photographs or access to their child to some third party. in exchange for money that is then used to purchase drugs. And there are two things I want to emphasize here when we're talking about this very difficult topic. The first is that children are almost always the forgotten victim of every crisis. Child sex trafficking is not something that you're hearing about on the news. When they're covering the opioid crisis, it's not something that's getting attention when we're talking about this. And it's important as service providers that when we hear about drug use in the home, we're pressing further on behalf of these kids. And the second thing I want to emphasize here is that the market does exist for the sexual exploitation of children. And to demonstrate that, I'll tell you one of my experiences in my prior work in anti-trafficking. I was partnering with a police team in a Midwestern state. So this was not in Tennessee, but it was nearby, that was building a sting operation for the solicitation of minors online. And what they were doing was pretty straightforward. They were posing as a trafficker who had a 15-year-old girl available for sex on Backpage. And within 1 hour, they had 100 combined texts and phone calls of perpetrators who wanted to buy sex from that child. So as far from reality as it seems for any decent human being at all, we have to recognize that this is happening. We're not recognizing it, and that it is happening within families. The parent in me sees this as something simply too dark to engage or hear about sometimes, and the community service provider in me knows that this is too big an issue for any one of us to begin to tackle well. But I think one of the most important things we can do is not talk about the why this happens, not try and get at root cause, but instead talk about what the implications are and how we can fix it. Before we dive into talking about implications and next steps, though, I briefly want to rope in the topic of child marriage because there is a lot of overlap with child marriage and familial trafficking. Until 2018, very recently, there was no minimum age to marry in Tennessee. And over the last 2 decades, we have seen marriages of girls as young as 10 to men in their 30s. Last spring, we changed that. We set, as a state, 17 as the minimum age for marriage. And the implications here were that a child who could not consent to sex was being given a legal exemption in order to get married. So taking the example of a 16-year-old and a 21-year-old, their sex outside of marriage is considered statutory rape, but it's sanctioned under a legal marriage. So let's say a 17-year-old wants to get a divorce. She can be represented by an attorney as a minor. That is something that she's able to do, is to be represented. But as part of her divorce, she's going to have established through the court that she's still legally emancipated. She's going to have to become clogged up in the court system so that she can obtain the right to do very, very necessary things like signing a lease of somewhere to live on her own, or contacting the power company and getting utilities in her home. So while we've come a very long way, when we put minors who cannot consent in situations like marriage, we are asking a lot, and we are not setting youth up for success. So just imagine a youth who's marrying into a family who is not going to treat her well. Think of all the contractual obligations and the lack of options that she will have in that scenario. I bring child marriage up because it is comprised of the elements that make up domestic servitude, labor trafficking, and sex trafficking. And I am certainly not saying that every case of child marriage is a trafficking situation, but this is something that you'll want to look for if you're serving minors who are married or legally emancipated in their relationships. So that wraps up the 4 types of familial trafficking for today: unrecognized, forced labor, sex trafficking, and child marriage. And I hope that you are on the edge of your seat wondering what you can do as a service provider to make an impact. And the next steps are actually very simple. First, include trafficking in your definition of family violence, both on paper and in practice. Screen for it. Learn the red flags. Get trained on indicators if you have not already done so. Make sure that everyone at your organization that has contact with clients can spot a suspected case of trafficking and is equipped with the tools that they need to act if they see a suspicious situation. Talk through examples, work through scenarios in your staff so that you're prepared when it happens. Next, make sure that you're ruling human trafficking out instead of ruling it in, especially when there is an allegation of incest or one-time sexual abuse. Human trafficking is almost never disclosed as such. In my experience, it is maybe 1 out of 100 victims will raise their hand and say, I'm a victim of human trafficking. It's almost always disclosed instead as an incest or rape situation. And often, child victims don't even understand the dynamics of what is happening to them. So make sure that you're referring out to your child advocacy centers and law enforcement. They are trained to sort of tell the difference, and make sure that you're listening for trafficking when you're working with parents. Make sure that you assume that trafficking is taking place when you hear these allegations and rule it out instead of listening for keywords to rule it in. And lastly, make a safe space for clients to discuss their working and living conditions. Practice interviewing in a non-judgmental and non-accusatory way when you're doing intake. It takes practice, I think, to find the balance between pressing for more information and honoring a person's privacy, especially in the settings that a lot of us are in. But it's almost always the right decision to ask to understand something better. So just for an example for that, one of the scenarios I encountered when I worked in child welfare was that there was a mother who was herself exchanging sex with a landlord for her rent payment. And this mother would nonchalantly say that she had to go pay her rent. Just like that, I've got to go pay my rent. And she needed child care to do so. Well, digging in with one additional open-ended question of, how do you pay your rent? Opened up the gate to learn more about what was happening, that had I phrased this as, well, why do you need child care to go pay your rent, and why is it going to take an hour? She probably would not have disclosed that situation, and we would not have been able to offer support there. Also, for next steps, I would like to make a plug for the 2 legal clinics that we operate at the Coalition. The Immigration Legal Clinic provides free consultations and legal representation to immigrant victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. And the Sexual Assault Legal Clinic offers services to sexual assault victims, things like family law matters, orders of protection, victims' comp, housing and employment, and other legal matters. Our clinics are available to provide TA to you as providers if you have questions and to take on clients. So I encourage you always to make the referral when you think it could be helpful, and our legal clinic will do an intake and see if that client qualifies under one of our clinics for representation. And you can reach the legal clinic by calling our office at the numbers above, so that's 615-386-9406, or you can always reach us toll-free at 800-289-9018. That concludes what I have for you today, and I'd like to open the floor up one more time for questions. And while those are coming in, I'll let you know that when you exit the webinar today, you'll see a survey. Please do take the time to fill that out if you can. We really value that feedback. It's something that really helps us prepare helpful and engaging content for you for the coming year. It's something that we really do implement when you give it to us. So please fill out that survey if you can. And I will wait just one more moment for questions. Okay, I see that Rick says that he did not have a survey after last week's training. I heard that from one or two folks, but I received several others. So if you do not receive the survey, you can send me an email, KTILLOTSON@tncoalition.org, and I'll be happy to send it to you directly. I apologize, Rick. We could not figure out why some folks were saying it and some folks were not, but I do greatly value your feedback. So if you do not this time around, please let us know. And I see that we have another question coming in. Oriana? Yes, I will be happy to send out a link for the survey for last week as well. We got the question, is there a statute of limitations for familial trafficking? That it gets a little difficult and it gets to be situation specific, but in general, no, we have not seen statute of limitations apply to trafficking situations. Also, these situations usually involve minors, which changes the game a little bit as well. But if you have a situation-specific question, that's something that our legal clinic could definitely answer for you. Thank you for that question. We have another question. With the new law on marriage, can a child leave? Yes, this is actually something I was just talking to our legal clinic about yesterday. The new law did not alter the divorce statutes in Tennessee with any sort of extra restrictions. So because it is considered a, quote, necessity to life, a youth who is married, a minor who is married, can file for a divorce and be represented legally by an attorney on paper. Now, of course, that makes the presumption that the child is physically able, mentally and physically able to go through the process of getting that attorney. And so while there's nothing legally blocking that, to answer your question, that does presume that there's nothing physically stopping that child from doing that, and that she, I say she, but that she or he is aware of the resources that that takes. Wonderful question. Will we have access to the slides after today? Yes, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like, I'm happy to send the slides out after as a PDF as well. Okay, thank you all so much for attending this webinar today. It's been really wonderful to talk through these things. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me directly. It's Carissa Tillotson, so KTILLOTSON @tncoalition.org, or you can give me a call, 615-386-9406. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.